Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversations at Art Basel, Miami Beach. I'm Ed Winkleman, and our panel this afternoon is Confronting Climate Change Denial. We have assembled an incredible panel of experts and advocates on this topic. I would like to address the elephant in the room, which is that an art fair is not an ecologically friendly venture. Art Basel is very aware of this. In fact, Art Basel has already initiated some long-term plans and strategies to address their own carbon footprint. There are members of Art Basel's team who'll be very happy to explain any more about that if anyone has particular questions. But today, we're very fortunate to have two artists who work in this topic, starting in the left-hand side, Alexis Rockman, who's based in New York, Allison Janae Hamilton, who is also based in New York, David Wallace-Wells, who's a deputy editor and a climate columnist at The New Yorker, and the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, and Sonia Succar Ferré, who is an environmental advocate based here in Miami. To guide us through the conversation is Stefanie Hessler, who is the director at the Trondheim Kunsthalle in Norway. And I would ask you all to join me in giving them a very warm welcome. One other quick note, we will have copies of David's book and some of Alexis's book on stage for a book signing after the conversation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks for the invitation to Ed Winkleman, who put together this panel together with Jenny Fulton, and thanks to Art Basel for bringing us here. So in 1962, Rachel Carson, a marine biologist and poet, wrote a book called Silent Spring, in which she addressed the problems of DDT, an insecticide that was used at the time and whose environmental impacts became known. Now we're more than half a century down the road, 2019, and we're becoming aware more and more of the ecological urgency, mainly climate change, especially in a city like Miami that is going to be, affected by rising sea levels sooner rather than later. I think this topic is particularly relevant to address, and also considering that hopefully many of you are interested in discussing how to offset or how to reduce our footprint on the planet. So it's fantastic that we have so many different perspectives here. Also, artists, writers, and people who are involved in policy and activism to address some of these topics. The overarching theme is climate change, but also climate change denial. I live in Europe, and in Europe, climate change denial is, it exists, but it is much more, less relevant or much, less powerful than here. And I know that, David, you've written about that topic also partly in your book, The Uninhabitable Earth. And perhaps we should start by discussing why climate is so difficult to tackle, or what creates this kind of fear in people that produces climate change denial. And David, if you don't mind, I would love for you to start.
I think each of us knows why it's hard, because none of us is living as though the crisis is as urgent as it is. So in the US, we often think about fossil fuel executives as being forces of great denial, or the Republican Party. But I think that sort of lets many of us on the left off the hook. We are all of us living in denial. When you really understand the scale of the crisis and the way it will transform the shape of human life on this planet over the next century, it requires a much larger commitment than almost anyone on the planet, aside from maybe Greta Thunberg, is really making. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. There's the simple fact that it's not comfortable to consider really scary scenarios. We, especially in the US, we've been raised to expect that the future is more prosperous and more just than the past. We want to believe that our own lives will be, and the lives of our children will be fulfilling in ways that, we were taught to expect as children. We have a kind of what economists call a status quo bias, where we're unwilling to contemplate radical change, and certainly to choose to make radical change. And then there's sort of obstacles all the way up the political ladder through, the social level and the political level and the geopolitical level, and facing all of those obstacles to action. It's sort of natural to turn away and not want to look squarely at the problem itself. Unfortunately, that's sort of what we need to do. We can't really afford to live in denial much longer. Scientists say that we have about a decade to cut in half global emissions to give us a decent chance of staying below 2 degrees of warming, which is a level of warming they call catastrophic, and the island nations of the world called genocide, and which would be really crippling for a place like Miami Beach. This is not a binary system. It's not like if we fail that test, then it's all over. But we don't have very much time to secure a future that anyone in this room today would recognize as livable and prosperous and just. And if we have a hope of doing that, we really have to sort of pull our heads out of the sand, as uncomfortable as that may be.
The anthropologist Anna Tsing actually wrote about that we require new arts of noticing in an age of climate change where previous certainties are becoming completely unrecognizable to us. She also writes about the myth of progress, which is something that you just addressed, and this kind of myth that in the global north, most of us sort of grew up with. And so there's something quite fundamental about that change that we need to embrace and that we need to accept and also, tackle in a way. And Allison, I was wondering if you could say something about, let's say art as a different tool of noticing in the sense of Anna Tsing. So art as a way to not necessarily reaffirm certain myths, such as the myth of progress, but to see things differently.
Yeah, of course. I mean, art and the arts in general have always had the ability to sensitize and to make and to bring, whether that's visually or sonically, bring to bear what's happening for some in a more intangible or abstract way. And unfortunately, as you just mentioned, this idea of what's going on with the climate, for some, it's this kind of abstract kind of idea that's kind of out there in the future, and it's almost overwhelming to figure out a way to deal with it. However, for many, that's a really a temporal kind of disconnect, because for many, climate change is here right now, and it really has been. And so for many populations, there's not a luxury of being able to worry about the future, because it's now. There's climate gentrification. There's the ways that, as the hurricanes become more and more intense, which is evidence-based, that the intensity every year. There's some conversations about the amount, the frequency, but definitely there's widespread agreement on what's happening with the intensity. Higher storm surges, more rainfall, more flooding. And so if you look at something like, for example, the history of as a Floridian, hurricanes are something that's always been kind of culturally part of my world. If you look at the history of how these natural disasters really illuminate social disasters that are already existing, you really get a chance to see how, for many, what's most worrying is not necessarily the science in what's physically happening, but the social aftermath of that thing. And artists have always tried to address that. For whether it's Zora Neale Hurston using the great Miami hurricane and the Okeechobee hurricane as this backdrop for Their Eyes Were Watching God, or Richard Wright, commenting on the Great Mississippi Flood. I mean, you have all of these models and examples of artists trying to grapple with this volatile environment, especially where I'm from, the region where I'm from, which is the American South. And so, the arts has the ability to kind of bring together this really complex conversation. And I think also, kind of destabilizing some of the myths that are existing. For example, this part of the country, believes that climate change is real and this part of the country is in denial. I mean, I think it's a lot more complex than that. And I think that the dialogue that is made available in the conversation in the world of art, of the arts, I think there's an opportunity to kind of collapse some of those barriers that I think are, it's a culture war that doesn't have to necessarily be. And I'm curious and excited about some of the ways that the arts has the ability to further some of those conversations.
And this is a perfect segue to Alexis. You made a work called Manifest Destiny in 1999, where you depicted the Brooklyn Bridge after a natural disaster such as global warming, for example, and this was 20 years ago. So since then, or even before that, you've been making work addressing climate change and ecological havoc that some parts of humanity are wreaking on the planet. So how have you seen, or what's your perspective on how the conversation has changed?
Well, I'm very conflicted because when I started making work about these issues in the mid-90s, after a conversation with a paleontologist, when I asked him, what are you afraid of? And he mentioned global warming, climate change, and he explained this scenario, I felt that we were in for a rough ride because it was the perfect storm of being invisible, being about long-term sacrifice, and being in the realm of bigger than us. Humans, it's God's domain if you want to go that direction. And certainly individuals rightly feel helpless in the face of this, let alone be willing to sacrifice. So that was in 1994 in Duluth, the coldest day I've ever been in, 37 below, paradoxically. But what I realized was that was a perfect thing for me to start thinking about in terms of my work. I'd been making paintings and drawings about the history of natural history and the biodiversity crisis, but I saw that as the perfect storm for myself of, it seemed apocalyptic, and I knew it was real, and it had genre implications, like some of my favorite things as a child, like Planet of the Apes or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's one of the problems with the genre of climate change, is that it resembles or mimics other things because it's incomprehensible. So I decided then, and I'd say a good 80% of my work since then has been about those issues. And Manifest Destiny came from a conversation I was having with Arnold Lehman, then the director of the Brooklyn Museum, and he asked me if I would be willing to make a painting for their grand reopening in 2004. It was a long way off. And I said, well, why don't I make a painting about climate change that has to do with Brooklyn? And I got the green light, more or less, and I decided that I wanted to approach the best or most, expert scientists at the time, which happened to be James Hansen and Cynthia Rosenzweig, and they were very open and generous to me. So I went through a list of people to talk to before I allowed myself the permission to even think about what the painting was going to be, other than I knew I was going to be standing on the banks of the East River looking towards Brooklyn, and whatever the science told me would dictate the iconography of the painting. And to make a long story short, 82 feet rise, which is just over the Brooklyn Bridge, whatever the bridge part of it, not the stanchion. And then I spent years doing research, and it wasn't a full-time job. I had to do other things to make a living during that period in terms of art stuff. But now the painting's in the Smithsonian, and which is great, and that's where it should be, as an icon of, a bitter icon of American industrial might.
Yeah, that's also beautiful because it brings together these different disciplines: art, science, history, of course, which we need to do if we want to address climate change from different perspectives and somehow account for the complexity that it presents us with. Sonia, you work in a much more hands-on way than maybe artists very often do. And you work quite a bit on affecting policy and working with organizations for, to protect water and nature at large. So how do you deal with these topics? And can the art somehow, add to that conversation from your point of view?
Yeah. So absolutely. I truly believe that it begins here on the local level, right? I mean, that's where you begin to feel these beginning effects. Here we are in beautiful Miami. Again, the weather's spectacular, the water is pristine, at least it looks like that, but it really starts at that local connection to the people around you, your families, your neighbors. You begin to realize that like we're all in this together. And these hurricanes and these storm events that are happening immediately put people into this sort of survival mode, right? And it's like, it's happening more frequently, it's in our face. I mean, here in Miami, we see it during certain times of the year that it's literally in our face where the water comes up, right? We have these king tide events, sunny day flooding as it's called. They're very dramatic moments and the water comes up and it's for a period of 2 or 3 days. So you see it and you're supposed to really connect with that and understand this is the future. It's a snapshot, right? And so take that information. Nature is telling us this is how it's going to react. These are the changes that are happening already. So it's really on us to be able to act on that, and ideally through the inspiration of artists. I mean, we're moved by art, right? So if anything, we can separate our political affiliations and just be in those moments, connected in those artistic connections and inspiring, calls of action right there. I think it's on all of us. As Ed was mentioning, I think Art Basel plays an immense role in showcasing that, right? It's 1 week here in Miami, and it begins in those moments. When it comes to action, again, we've been talking about this for long enough. This isn't a new phenomenon. This has been decades, right? Obviously, there's resources behind all of this funneling our denial, I should say. And we're becoming more and more aware of where those funds are coming from. But I think there's a real cry out there. I mean, literally, our children are crying and screaming in a way that it's front and center, asking for a climate emergency, climate crisis. Call it whatever it is. It's happening and it's very real. And so the work that I really try and do, at least locally here in Miami, is to really, again, connect on that local realm where people can feel like connected and there's movement in those steps from the local to the state level. I'm here in rain boots today, Act on Climate, joined by my husband, who's a state senator, pushing for legislation. It's very real to us. It's a family affair. And it's got to be 24/7. It's not something we talk about and we shelf, and then we talk about again. It's got to be in our art. It's got to be in our communications. As daunting and as heavy as it is, it's here. And so, of course, there has to be more promise and hope in that space. It's not meant to be, this is suffering. It's a slow-moving hurricane in many regards, but there's solutions out there. And that's the other beautiful part with art is that if you're able to project and design future scenarios, we're seeing this, through architecture and augmented reality, you're able to kind of design that future vision that you're looking for, right, with nature in that space. And so I think more than anything, the art, the architecture world can really help inspire us to present that future vision that we're trying to get to. It's heavy, it's hard, but it's doable. I mean, if there's anything worth saving, it's us, it's our children. And so it should be pulling on us, and it should be spoken about and talked about and acted upon at all times.
Thank you. I'll go back to you, David. In your book, you present an overwhelming amount of facts. You write, among other things, that by 2045, South Miami, or Miami Beach actually, may be flooded up to 14%. And you present a ton of other facts as well. I believe you say that if the wealthiest 10% reduce their emissions to the average European level, we would be reducing emissions by 30%. And I was really, overwhelmed in a way by all of the facts and the research, but it also seemed absolutely necessary to, actually present the wealth of material or this overwhelming mass of information to people out there, just to show how complex the topic is, but also to show that it's maybe not that hard to, not create correlations or not causalities necessarily, but some sort of correlation, even if they're highly complex. that's being said, so if the facts are there, if the science is there, why is there still denial? Why is it so difficult to push through and actually make, legislations happen, international agreements happen? I mean, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2017, which is, insane.
Well, I think that what we think of as true denial is actually becoming considerably less popular. In the U.S., depending on how you ask the question, the polls show between 70 and 80% of Americans are concerned about climate change to some degree, and that those numbers are up at least 10, in some cases 15% just over the last year, so it's moving very rapidly in the right direction. And still 25% of America is more people than I would like to be living in true climate denial, but 25% of Americans believe that aliens live on planet Earth with us. So I don't think that we need to necessarily, I don't think we need to defer to those people on climate policy in the same way that we don't hand the keys of NASA over to them either. I think the bigger problem is what I was talking about before, the sort of forces of complacency and inaction that function as denial. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think each of us benefit every day from the fossil economy, and we are uncomfortable even considering how to reorganize our lives, even though in some cases it wouldn't require such a dramatic reorganization. We don't even want to think about that. And that holds true, like I said a few minutes ago, at really every level of social organization. I think if you imagine this trajectory of climate consciousness growing in the way that it's growing, it won't be very long before our democratic politics will be unable to resist that call to more action. But the question is, what kind of action will be taken? And I think it's a crisis, a moral catastrophe that the U.S. pulled out of Paris. But no major industrial nation in the world is on track to meet its commitments under Paris. The only two countries in the world that are honoring those commitments at the moment are Morocco and Gambia. Even if we all did honor those commitments, we would be on track for over 3 degrees of warming, which would mean hundreds of millions of climate refugees, cities in South Asia and the Middle East that would be so hot in summer you couldn't walk around without risking heat stroke or death, hundreds of millions of people dying of air pollution. We would lock in the permanent loss of the planet's ice sheets, which would produce not just 80 feet of sea level rise, but 250 feet of sea level rise, $600 trillion in climate damages, which is double all the wealth that exists in the world today. This is the world that we'd be heading for if every country in the world was honoring the Paris commitments, and not a single nation is. So, the question of how we move forward, to me, it's an incredibly difficult puzzle that has challenges, like I said, at every level. The level that most concerns me is the geopolitical one. I can see national governments taking quite fast action, and actually over the last year we've seen a conservative parliament in the UK declare a climate emergency and commit to zero carbon by 2050. The governments of Denmark and Finland and Norway have all made quite ambitious commitments to decarbonization. But looking at the global picture, China's the world's biggest emitter, and they're responsible for about 30% of emissions. The US is second with about 15%. And then it's India at 7%, and then after that, no other country is more than 3%. So no nation in the world is like having a clear, significant impact on the climate of the future. Even a country like China that's contributing 1/3 of all emissions, if they rapidly decarbonize and no one else in the world takes action, then it'll be basically for naught. And that's especially true for a country like Australia or any of the Scandinavian countries. They could decarbonize tomorrow, never emit another ton of carbon, and they'd still be living with the same climate as they would if unless everybody else in the world took action too. And that's this real collective action problem. Who's going to lead the way, and why would anyone act if the world isn't acting in concert? I don't know that I see a solution to that problem, which is the thing that scares me most. The Paris Accords were kind of an attempt to organize a global, coordinated political movement, but they were undertaken at a time when so many countries in the world are retreating from international organization and international cooperation, retreating from and into a sort of more narrow sense of nationalistic self-interest. I worry that that will continue and will swamp any real effort to move together, which is why I've started to think personally that it might be a more productive model not to think of the sort of international UN system as the basis for climate action, but something like the nuclear non-proliferation agreements of the 1980s, when the world's two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, came to an agreement and then basically bullied the rest of the world to act in concert. It would take a huge change of perspective in the US and in China to make that happen. But on some level, I still see that as maybe a more plausible path forward than one in which we get all 186 nations of the world to agree to particular standards that they then honor, given that we came to an international agreement in Rio in 1992, in Montreal, in Kyoto, and now in Paris, and none of those agreements have produced any progress on climate at all.
I mean, now we're talking mainly about the sort of meta level of nation states, but also intergovernmental organizations and so on. And of course, these are extremely important, but the base upon which they're built is also embedded in racial, gendered histories, that are deeply unjust. So if we rely on these sorts of structures to solve the problem that we're in, I think, we're not really going towards a structure or really, tackling the problem at its root. Of course, it is important to use the tools that we have as of today, such as legal systems, etc. But I do think that we need to also listen to other kinds of voices, that have been systematically excluded from these kinds of conversations. Allison, you mentioned those a little bit earlier, and I know that some of your work is also dealing with that quite particularly, especially your research into hurricanes. Historically and today, and how they affect Black communities. I think you looked at two particular hurricanes from 1926 and 1928 for your work at Storm King quite recently. Could you talk a bit more about your research and in particular relating to the injustices?
Right, yeah, so for the Storm King project, it was a monumental homage to the people who perished in these two hurricanes. The first was the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926, and then the Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928. And I'd come across this song that was written by Judge Jackson called Florida Storm. And in the kind of, we call it Floribama kind of coast, there was this style of music called shape note singing. It was this kind of religious hymnal type of call and response music. And almost all of it that I kind of went through was this kind of religious and spiritual music. But I found this one song that was a secular hymn that was written called Florida Storm, and it was in response to the Great Miami Hurricane. And then the same year that song was released, then the Okeechobee Hurricane happened, and that's the one that I'd mentioned earlier that was the backdrop for Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so in the second hurricane, thousands of Black migrant workers were killed in that storm and buried in these mass unmarked pits. And only pretty recently did they even get like a marker. I think there's like one kind of in the Deltona area now. But learning about those two storms, but not only the storms themselves, but the response and lack of response and the kind of inhumane treatment of the people who dealt with those really kind of took me on this research journey into looking at these patterns of storms. So whether you're looking at, the Galveston hurricane of 1900, where really set this narrative of like looting and like, what happens when, people are kind of on the loose, and these myths of, which communities are a threat in the aftermath of storms, when really they're the victim of what's happened. And then you could look at, again, I mentioned the flood in Mississippi. The Mississippi flood in 1927 that Richard Wright fictionalized or drew from. And then you look at, of course, I don't even have to mention, the horrific aftermath of Katrina. And then when I was working on that Storm King project, we had also just had Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and I'm looking at these images of, the President of the United States throwing paper towels into this crowd of people. And so, it really got me thinking about how what happens after these huge disastrous weather events, it's really just kind of a microcosm of what already happens on a day-to-day level with communities. And it also brings up, the fact that the people who are contributing the least to the issue of climate change are the ones who are suffering the most now, have in the past and will continue. And then that kind of just links to the whole history of a social and cultural experience of the landscape in relationship to what's going on as we imagine a continued intensity that's relating to climate. And it's not just hurricanes, that's the kind of angle I took most recently, but you can see it in so many different ways. And you look at the populations that are most vulnerable, it's, you know, poor folks, rural folks, women, people who rely on agriculture. I'm speaking in the US context, but you can completely see parallels all over. And again, the irony of it is also that not only is it that the people that are contributing the least are bearing the brunt, but a lot of those communities have long-standing traditions and ways that those who are contributing the most to the problem could actually learn from, you know. And in the U.S. context, a lot of that, again, it's that kind of quote-unquote flyover country, or in the South, or in Appalachia, and these places where you would assume that, okay, that's where the climate deniers must be. But really, those are the places where you see some of the most sustainable practices, where the ways that waste, there's less waste, there's more sustainable food practices, and a lot of things that people, those of us who live in these kind of cultural capitals and the urban city centers and the coastal parts of this country could really learn from. And so, you know, I think that, you know, with, you know, given art's ability to bring folks together and to have these kind of conversations, one thing that I'm hoping to see is, you know, more partnerships with some of our major institutions, with, you know, the less sexy, you know, local and regional arts and cultural spaces that really have a lot to offer to the conversation based on what the populations there have been doing for decades and even centuries.
Does you wanted to say
I just
something?
wanted to build, listening to, you know, your work on Hurricane Miami and the history there. What's interesting too is those communities there are, you know, that eventually moved into those spaces in Belglade and Pahokee. You know, there's a dike now that protects future flooding, which is so interesting because those areas are really low-lying parts of the state, but now you have communities that you're trying to protect from future flooding. So again, I mean, that was in the 20s, but, you know, hurricanes are supposed to shake us up into how we're building, designing, redesigning our cities, you know. And so if we're not learning during those moments, I mean, it becomes really lost revenue, right? I mean, we're not making economic sense to continue to invest in these unsustainable practices. And so I think that's also what's happening, is that, you know, that's coming up now, and people are saying, you know, I want to know where my public tax dollars are going. I mean, if it's to basically sustain, you know, communities that should not be living in, you know, low-lying parts of the state, but then again, those are ag communities that provide food for us, and so it's this weird dynamic. And certainly on you know, social justice front, climate gentrification, you know, what's happening too is higher elevation, you know, parts of South Florida are becoming very desirable, right? I mean, we have to eventually see that the water is coming and you're going to go towards less risky parts of the cities and the region. What does that do, right? Those are shock factors to huge communities that have been there for a long time. I mean, I'm a fourth generation, you know, Floridian. I want to be here. I want my kids to be here. But I mean, there does come a point that you have to look at the future and you want to go and move and live in places that are less risky. And so, you know, it's just interesting to see all of this play out. It's very real time. It's history, you know, repeating itself in many ways. But I think, again, art and culture is supposed to help kind of shake us up where we're not. This is daunting, the science, the information. Sometimes, I mean, when you're living in this space, you don't realize we're in our own bubble sometimes, and the science and the data is overwhelming, right? And so you want to just kind of put it to the side and tell me what's in front of me. But yeah, you know, sometimes that's why science and art need to better merge together, where you can describe in your artwork real relevant data that might not be understood on, you know, a New York Times piece, for instance, right? But you can maybe understand it through storytelling and through, you know, paintings. I think that's where people are more likely to be able to tap into. through their Instagram feed, et cetera. And so if there's a way to pull in that information and that data through those realms, I really foresee, especially our culture and our generation now, where we just absorb all of this in this cyclical 24/7 cycle of social media, that's where we need to plant the information. It's got to be there where we're feeling it. Because if not, we're waiting for the scientists to save us, or we're waiting for people to pay attention to the science, and it's just too much. The data is overwhelming for the common person to kind of capture and absorb all of that. So.
Yeah, the feminist theorist Donna Haraway calls it staying with the trouble. She says that it's not easy to make causalities, but that's also the interesting place to be, because now you mentioned social media, and I agree, of course, we need to use the tools that we have, but social media also produce emissions. So, how do we balance these kinds of issues? And it's extremely complex, but maybe also an exciting, moment to start from and to also stay in this complexity. Another thing.
I worry sometimes that like being in sitting with it is just a strategy of normalization and acclimatization. I did some reporting earlier this spring in California about the fires, and was horrified as a New Yorker to encounter people who had lived through 9 wildfires and were not even considering moving. And I said, how could you live through this and look at this landscape and consider it habitable? And they said, oh, but you're from New York, right? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, you lived through Sandy, right? And I was like, fair point. I think that there is a way in which extreme weather and storytelling about climate change is waking us all up. But to judge us by the actions we're taking, we're not nearly as awakened as we should be. And especially when you look at all of these issues from a climate justice perspective, I really worry that our primary cultural response will be to define more and more suffering as acceptable, especially when it's in the global south or in communities within the US that are already impoverished or marginalized. I think that we're seeing those impacts already. There have been studies showing that countries across the equatorial band of the planet have lost as much as a quarter of their GDP over the last 4 decades because of climate change. That the whole phenomenon of Islamic terrorism is tied up in climate impacts. But we're not treating them as, first of all, as climate stories, and second of all, as a reason to really dramatically change our own behavior. We're just, sort of retreating into a narrower sense of our own self-interest and trying to protect ourselves, which is to say, accommodate ourselves or design a future for ourselves in a world that is nevertheless suffering at unprecedented levels.
There's something quite remarkable about the human ability to create an outside, or to conceive of ourselves as outside of the things that are happening, which is a modernist construct, no? That we divide nature and culture, and we think of ourselves as being within culture and without, nature. And one might think that, with hurricanes and so on, we need to realize that we're actually part of nature and that there's no escaping, But there's something quite persistent about that particular myth of this divide and our in the global north, safety. Alexis, you wanted to say something, and then I have a question for you.
I think that it's not. I think strands of that are a modernist construct. Nature is outside, but humans are tribal to the bone or the DNA, and we destroyed all other hominids, or had sex with them and then destroyed them or absorbed them throughout our evolutionary history. We're intensely tribal in this room, I'm sure. And that's something that I think we have to acknowledge in terms of what we're dealing with here. What was the question?
Well, no, I mean, yes, absolutely. But that's also why we need to see these connections, no? That we're not separate from a community who absorbs the, climate disaster.
David's solution of having, using the nuclear powers bullying the rest of the model of Russia and America from the Accord, I think is the most coherent argument or, plan I've heard yet. Because it was successful, and that is something to hope for I think, in terms of what's possible.
I was recently talking to Christiana Figueres, who used to run the UNFCCC, so she was like in charge of the Paris Accords, basically. And I asked her how we could try to convince more nations of the world to see their own shared fate and take action in response to that understanding. And she's not just this sort of one of the architects of the Paris Accords. She also now runs an organization called Global Optimism. So she's like, she's an optimist. And she said, we can. She said the mistake of the Paris Accords was to try to appeal to everyone's
Best nature.
better angels of their nature. And she said what we need to do instead is make a case through self-interest, which she said you could actually do, which I think is really important and has been an undertold part of the story, through conversations about public health. Because when you talk about climate change generally, what the US does or what California does or what all of Europe does or what India does, the impacts won't be contained within those countries. And so it's really hard to bring them into alignment with their own goals. What the US does, the benefits will be distributed globally, or the negative impacts will be distributed globally. But public health is much more local. And it's that's especially true when you start thinking of these things in terms of climate justice. The people who live near chemical plants are those who can't live anywhere else. The people who are breathing in polluted air are those people who can't afford to live elsewhere. And the benefits of cleaning up just that pollution are they're really striking. 9 million people are dying globally every year from air pollution, which is a holocaust that we're committing every year. And the economist recently came out with a report saying that the benefit of the environmental cost of the coal industry in the U.S. has totally outweighed the economic benefits over the last decade. That the public health impact has been so bad that we'd have been better off, all told, if we just retired the coal industry entirely. And so I think there is like a kind of a public health case to be made there. But I also do worry about approaching the whole problem through this narrow, self-interested lens. Because I don't know, I just don't want to live in a world where the only way we can persuade anyone to do anything is to appeal to their self-interest.
I just have one anecdote that occurred to me while you were mentioning that. I've been thinking a lot about Cleveland in the 60s, and Carl Stokes, and the ability to get the Clean Water Act passed, and with his brother. And one of the things that, and for those of you that don't know, Carl Stokes was the first African-American mayor of a major American city. And he had the brilliance to see that environmental issues and justice were racial justice. At that point, the only people that were living in Cleveland proper were African-Americans because they couldn't afford to flee. And it was so polluted and impossible for them to leave that they were literally, it was making them sick. So I think that is a success story from our history as a country that we might want to keep in mind.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think looking back at those environmental historical moments, they're pivotal. That's where that local change happened, right? The water's so polluted, and I think in the case of other cities, I think it was Boston where the river literally caught on fire. Those are real dramatic moments that shifted people's perception that it was happening. On the notion of just public health, I think you really awaken people, right, when you're talking about those health, air quality, water quality. Those are things that you have control over, you want to have control over. And it's not just traditional, health, it's wellness too, right? To your point about nature, sometimes I'm most connected by just sitting in a park and just shutting off a little bit. I think that's lost a bit, and you hear things, and the world around you is in a way speaking to you, right? And that's needed more and more. There was a moment, or if you're privileged enough to go out to national parks and feel that connection, it's phenomenal. But for the day-to-day, and certainly the most underserved, the best that they have are their community parks around them. And we need to connect into those spaces and tap into that, because there's a real awareness that happens in those moments when you kind of turn off and you hear and you see the water in the stream. and you become conscious, what's in there? What is that oil slick? Or why am I not breathing so well today? Those, I think, are those moments that create these pivotal moments of crisis where local action happens and essentially, hopefully, state and federal action happens. I really think it begins sometimes when we quiet ourselves and we listen and we can actually find more answers with nature.
The one thing, I totally agree with what you're saying. The one thing that I might complicate that a little bit is that a lot of the underserved populations that we have live in rural places and are living, and are laboring every day in nature, and are really experiencing not only the beauty and everything that you just said that I totally get, but they're also experiencing firsthand the violence and the intersections of all of that. From a class, race, and gendered perspective, kind of in that day-to-day economy of various parts of the country. For example, whether that's turpentine farming, which just was something that right on the heels of American slavery, like right through Reconstruction up until I think the last barrel of turpentine left the South Georgia, Northern Florida region in 2001. So that, it's a continued connection between what's happening in our rural spaces with kind of these, again, disasters. And usually I am very optimistic, but when I think about the idea and the proposal of looking at it through public health, I can't help but think about Flint, Michigan, and how still, not enough has been done there, or Cancer Alley. And I become a little bit skeptical about handling the issue through public health because I think it might depend on who's the population that's suffering. Or, I also worry about, again, thinking back on Galveston or these other disasters and this threat and myth of a population. The population that is the most vulnerable and that's hurting now becomes the myth of plague, these people are sick and that means XYZ for us who are, you know what I mean? So there's a push and pull there. That I worry about, but I do think that I like the idea of there being other kind of avenues and angles. I would be curious to see where public health could take the, if it could really run the ball, to use a football analogy. I'm from Florida, but in the face of something like Cancer Alley, especially, I'm just wondering where are the limits. And where are the opportunities?
And I think this links back to, having to really rethink our value systems and the way that we actually construct the, also political, legal, economic systems that we live in, and whether there's a way to actually, undo and rethink them much more deeply. I know that we have to stop soon, and I wanted to open up the floor for questions. Okay, lots of hands, great. We have a microphone, so just wait for 1 second.
Yes, it's very interesting, but I believe that nuclear power is kind of more of a centralized thing, and I think what we really need is, as you say, to rethink the social system and have maybe more passive things like solar power and other new technologies, rather than something that also can add additional pollution. But perhaps I'm just coming from a scientific combined with technology point of view, which I'm not seeing a lot of on the stand. But I do appreciate everyone's input.
I don't recall anyone mentioning nuclear energy. Do you?
But to the point of solar, I don't think anyone questions that. I think you have to see who's doing it, right? I'll call out the state of Florida right now. We're not doing enough of that. I think we're at barely 3% renewable energy, whereas Texas and California are 20% or above. So absolutely, but there's monopolies, there's systems in play there. Those are power structures that we need to get through. On the nuclear point, look, we have a power plant here in most vulnerable part of the country, and we're still fighting regulations on trying to expand their footprint. They want a second power plant. So these are real issues that we're already having. But if you don't have alternatives, renewables, and those industries coming in and helping the political system see that there's opportunities where they can succeed by announcing renewable energy plans. Unfortunately, these monopolies sort of dominate the political systems.
We have made like enormous progress on renewables. The prices have fallen dramatically over the last decade. In much of the world, it's now cost competitive with dirty energy. In some parts of the world, it's even cheaper to build new renewable capacity than continue running old fossil infrastructure. But over that same period of time, we've made no progress in the ratio between green energy and dirty energy globally. So even though solar and wind is much, much cheaper than it was a decade or certainly 4 decades ago, proportionally, we're doing just as bad as we did in the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s. And I think that suggests actually that we do need more centralized action through political and policy change. When you sort of understand that in order to get a handle on warming, we can't just be satisfied with reducing our emissions. We need to zero them out entirely because any additional amount of carbon will warm the planet further. That gives you a whole different perspective on the kind of scale of change that's necessary, because we're going to need a new electric grid, and individuals can't build a new electric grid. We're going to need new battery technology, and we're going to need massive R&D spending to bring that about. We're going to need a different kind of airplane, because the airplanes we have today are never going to be made to run without carbon emissions, and all through all of the sectors that produce carbon. And the scale of that challenge is so large, I think it's really hard to imagine approaching seriously at the individual level. It has to come through coordinated policy responses.
To add to that, with renewable energies, things are not that easy, unfortunately, because renewable energies still require minerals. And so I just wrote a book about ocean and deep sea mining from an artistic research perspective, where I looked in particular at these entanglements and basically how we need minerals from the ocean floor that companies and governments are now, preparing to mine. And of course, renewable energies are fantastic, but if we destroy the oceans and ecosystems at 5,000 and deeper, depth that we don't properly understand yet, and where the origins of life actually began, most likely, how does that affect global warming further? So that's the complexity of things. So, yeah, renewables are important, but it's not quite as easy.
I have a quick question, maybe particularly for Allison and Sonia. I'm going to lay out a few points so that I can establish the framework for the question. We're in a temporary city right now, and temporary cities exist all around, whether it's an art fair or the Immigrant Detention Children's Center or a refugee tent city like after Hurricane Andrew that I was in. I'm an artist. I've been here in between New York and Miami. I have a carbon footprint for that reason. But I also go to parties where the wealthiest 1%, I get an opportunity to have a conversation with the people that you're talking about as perhaps having the potential to make an impact. I think there are some important intersections happening during this actual week, and an extreme separation of class going on, which I don't know who's sitting in this audience right now. But there are some important things that artists are doing, actually, not just in terms of visual representation, but actual direct action. For example, Neri Ward's show at the New Museum, one of his things that he did in selling those works was contributing to a nonprofit. So if you bought the work, you were actually directly giving money to a particular nonprofit, who I'm forgetting. So that's one example. Artist resale contracts. There's a lot of ways I think that direct action can happen. My question, I guess, is, Art Basel's been going on for a while. They talked at PAM about how Christo and Jean-Claude made Art Basel happen. They made this international city. Miami turned into this global metropolis. And what's happened, we've gotten 40 new condos on the horizon as a result. The waste infrastructure is so overwhelmed that we have like a poop cannon that shoots poop a mile offshore and comes back, right? So I couldn't take my child to the beach because she was having trouble breathing. So I guess I'm wondering, in a hopeful way, in what ways can this kind of temporary sort of hovering that artists do now, especially if you're at blue chip level, in what ways can we directly impact and have direct conversations with policy? And I want to just throw out the amazingness, and Jose Javier's here, that Amendment 4 got started as a petition. So I just want to kind of point out some things, because I do think there's a lot of hope, and I do think everyday people who are perhaps in the middle class, or let's just assume that if you're coming to Art Basel, so I just want to, I'm wondering if perhaps the 2 women or 3 women can kind of point out some of the other potentials and things that everyday people can do to directly impact action, direct action. Yeah. Sorry.
I love your question. For me, I think that one of the most important things, as you're saying, this is a temporary kind of, like something even more than a city. I don't know, I don't know. But, to me, it's important to realize where you are. Like, whose land has this been? Who lives here? Who lives right over there in Little Haiti that's getting pushed out further and further and further? Who was here before? Who's been here decades ago, centuries ago? What practices relating to the environment have been going on by those people? What is the knowledge base that has already been here and that is already existing that hopefully those of us who are here for these temporary amounts of time could start to draw from in ways that are not overwhelming and overburdening that community, but perhaps putting something in place that's actually restorative and reparative. So for me, we talk a lot about, okay, we in the West this, or we here this, but, culturally for me, I come from a culture where you look towards your elders, you look towards history, and you look towards what has happened before you. And so I think that there's, again, I keep going back to this idea that there's so much that's happening that's just baked into the culture that's moving through life and living in a more sustainable way, that I think that, again, those of us who really care about the issues could just draw from, and just who's in the community that we're in. Like, this is not just this wasteland until Art Basel comes to town. There are people here who have knowledge and deep expertise and lived experience. So again, for me, it's all about trying to figure out ways where dialogue can happen. And so as an artist, for me, it's important to have part of my practice that is based in community, that is allowing for exchange and a continued system of shared knowledge. So, that's something I'm working on in my home region in Northern Florida, but I would love to see more opportunities come about to where something like a fair or something like a temporary exhibition or something can draw from what has already been brilliantly existing, but unfortunately maybe hasn't had enough resources to make to really contribute to like the big global and geopolitical level needs that we have.
Yeah.
I actually want to say something.
Sorry.
No.
If you can comment directly, Sonia, about the special area plan, because I don't know if everyone knows about that, and how the museums and the families are opening up the development in the climate gentrification areas you talked about.
Yeah, so good point, and I'm glad you're obviously plugged in locally. I think, like you said, I think that's so important when you come to these fairs. We're in this wonderful tent, 80,000 people, but there's communities here, there's neighborhoods. There's big changes locally that are happening. Some of the collectors are now opening from Wynwood into Allapattah. For those that don't know, Allapattah is a really old historical part of Miami. Early settlement, early history, working class neighborhood, hospital, healthcare system there. There's collectors opening spaces there. And as wonderful as that is, I'm hopeful those collectors will showcase, right, changes that are happening or art that can help showcase the environment. I'm doing some work in that area on a creek. I'm trying to restore a creek in the middle of Allapattah that people have no idea exists. It's the most polluted creek in the entire state. And so it is the responsibility of the collectors and, fairs like this. Special area plans, those are, there were incentives, and we're disrupting that now to build these massive developments in order to create job growth and economic activity. People now realize now in 2020, we don't need massive development. Small scale can work, and you can potentially really invite development that's, at a scale-wide level so that, you feel that local connection. But I even want to bring out the point of understanding your landscape. We're talking about that. My Lebanese grandfather would always say, when you travel, stop and learn about the geographic area you're in. Take a moment while you're here for the week. There's wonderful art, but there's also art in other places around us, beneath us. Learn about the porous limestone beneath your feet, which is essentially part of the problem is that what we're dealing with is that the water's coming up through these porous limestones. So it's important to know the geography, the topography. Again, I reiterate the importance of slowing down sometimes to feel connected to these spaces. We move fast. These fairs hop us from spot to spot, but there's a lot of action and activity, I will plug out, there are local leaders, statewide leaders here doing stuff, and it's important to connect with them. We were talking even about this article that came out about the panel, kind of natural criticism, right? Here you are in a space, but is Art Basel really doing enough to talk about climate change or showcase it, right? But this is a platform, and at least they're giving us this to be able to speak about it. Hopefully there's a lot more of that in the future, and they feel that there's interest in this subject. So I think that's also needed, and the pressure is there. But thank you for the question and for keeping the attention on this.
I just want to talk about there's, being from New York, you have a sense that, and both David and I grew up there. One of the reasons that I wanted to be an artist was to get out of Manhattan and learn about the world, and I just finished a 5-year project about the history and future of the Great Lakes that has been embraced by local institutions around the Great Lakes. It has 6 venues. It's going to end up in Flint this coming spring. And I agree completely with the local versions of what you're talking about. This is, policy is our only hope, and looking in your backyard is the way to go. But when you live in Manhattan, I've done projects about Manhattan too, besides Manifest Destiny. But the idea that every place is worth paying attention to and cherishing, and there's so many versions of this all over the planet that I think activism and art and all these issues that could come together and really get things going in the right direction. That's paradoxically optimistic coming from me.
Well, I think that, as a curator, what I find important is contribute to the knowledge production in different ways, and giving artists opportunities, especially artists who, maybe haven't been given opportunities as much in the past, and to give space to voices that have been excluded. And, I think it's also very important to listen, like just shut up and listen.
I have a question for David and for Sonia. David, I read your book, really enjoyed it. I wanted to read it because I wanted to have concrete examples I could give to people about things that have already happened, not things that are going to happen in the future, and you had so many of them. My question is, you had the elements of chaos in your book. Which elements of chaos do you think there's more awareness on? If you could pick one, which one has the most awareness right now? And then Sonia, I'm so glad you touched on how we should talk about right here, like what's going on in Miami and how it's going to be affected in the future. In Miami Beach, there's trillions of dollars worth of value, but by any conservative scientific measure, this island, a lot of it will be consumed by water by the end of the century. Could you speak to what people are saying here about that, or are they just literally ignoring it completely? Thanks.
I think the 3 that people are most aware of these days are sea level, which has been talked about for a generation, wildfires, which has been a huge story over the last couple of years. What was the third I was going to mention? Anyway, wildfires is like the growth area of awareness for sure, and it's like been devastating in Australia just in recent weeks. And I would say the next thing is going to be air pollution. That is going to be an increasing concern. I mentioned that 9 million people a year are dying from air pollution, but it also affects premature birth and low birth weight. It affects rates of schizophrenia and autism and ADHD. Every aspect of mental health and biological health that you can imagine is damaged by small particulate pollution, and we haven't really begun to reckon with that. And I think that's the next phase.
To the point of what are people saying and what are they doing? So Miami Beach, like you said, I mean, this is a barrier island. So I'll start there. You know, these were mangroves at one time, and when the bay was dredged, it filled this island up to build on. So we are sitting on islands. The Miami Beach was the first to really feel these effects, right? Like I told you, the king tides kind of made it very dramatic. And locally, they started putting in pumps and seawalls to kind of help deal with the situation. I think over time, they've realized you can't pump your way out of this. And so nature is really trying to come back into these spaces, and local leaders are allowing that, right? Allowing for flooding to happen and to be absorbed by green spaces, bioswales, storms. So they are doing that. Miami on the mainland is watching what the beach is doing, right? So we're all learning from each other. But there are some serious areas that are just, the flooding is just too frequent. The projections are getting worse. Just this week in Key West, there was a massive climate compact, and it was the discussion of retreat was just talked about for the first time. What does that mean? You're the letting perhaps roads go, and those are hard, difficult conversations, right? But there comes a point in how much are you going to invest in that infrastructure if you could only see it last for 20, 30 years, right? And so these hard conversations are happening. I think local leaders are feeling responsible with public tax dollars. The spotlight, scrutiny is on us to do the right thing. But it's positive because, again, there's ways that we are just learning from each other, and at least, like I said, nature, there's a lot of data that showcases leaving nature in its place. Mangroves mitigate storm surge and flooding. Phenomenal. Let's leave the mangroves in place or add more of that into these spaces. It's really, of course, real estate is dependent. The economy here locally is dependent on growth, and so it's important that we maybe shift that economy a little bit or learn to design in ways that growth can deal with these future impacts if we intend to live here, right? I mean, some people, there will come a point that they will migrate, and that will start happening, and there's a lot of people projecting that. So I want to be hopeful. Things are happening, and they're continuing to invest in these ways to have us livable here. But it is week by week, day by day, that we're pushing that sort of action. And I will say one thing, I'm very hopeful. City Hall lately, whether it's Miami Beach, City Miami, Miami-Dade County, there are a lot of activists showing up and watching how money is being spent, how policies are being enacted. That pressure is there because, people are scared, right? That's your investment, your home, and you want to make sure that, locally they're investing for the long term.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So,
Hi. First of all, thank you for all the work that you do and for putting this on. Jumping off of some of what has been said, I think we're kind of living in this moment of hypocrisy, and this question is specifically for the people who are creating objects, books, paintings, photos. And Al, you kind of already answered part of this question, but where it's kind of like, even just to speak to this problem is kind of inherently violent. Even just to bring everyone here together today to have this conversation is kind of inherently violent. And because of the large-scale infrastructure of our society, where, to make a post on social media requires heavy metals and electricity or, whatever it may be. Where any kind of action is inherently kind of an inaction. And it's this contradiction that I'm always trying to address in the work. I don't really have answers as much as questions, and I guess I kind of wanted to know if any of you are kind of addressing this formally or conceptually, not that there's really a difference, in the work, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's such an important part of this whole conversation. I mean, I would love to get on a epic Skype conversation with all y'all, but, here we are. I think that within the context of, something like the fair or the Biennale or the thing that draws, all of us together from all these corners of the world, I don't think that those things are not going to happen. So I think that it's being able to have the conversations, or to try to make the most of it now that we're here. I think that's, at least for me as an artist, that's where I'm trying to go. It's like, well, what can I do with what can I do once the person's in the building? Like, what can I offer and contribute? So, it's complex. We were talking about it. Yeah, she says there's not really an outside to it. Exactly. So, we were talking about it a little bit backstage. It kind of feels like a catch-22 in a lot of ways.
Coping. That's...
And because it feels like a catch-22, I mean, really the only thing you can do is to make a choice, And so that choice is going to be different for every person. But for me, and I love what you said too about, whether it's formally, conceptually, or some kind of other type of practice, it's all kind of part of your art making. It's kind of all part of your practice, or to use that word. So for me, personally, I'm thinking of ways that I can involve the local communities and try to bring them into the dialogue, because what I don't want to see for me is, to make work that's didactic, or that's like, here's what, you know what I mean? Like prescriptive. Again, just going back to, culturally, like coming from a place where you are supposed to exchange with the community, you're supposed to dialogue with your elders, you're supposed to bring people together in an intergenerational way. So for me, it's looking kind of like more of an in-practice type of arm to my work as an artist. But everyone really kind of grapples with that differently. And I know you're doing, amazing work on that as well. I think it's going to be different from person to person. But to me, it's kind of like, well, we're here, so now what do we do with that, Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, I think like everybody up here, probably like everyone in this room, I'm like bothered a bit by my own climate hypocrisy. But I also think that what we call hypocrisy is often just our desire to see the collective perform better than we can as individuals, and that we should not be afraid of living that way. And I think, I didn't just grow up in New York. I grew up, born in 1982, came of age in the 1990s at the end of history. And I was like bombarded with these lessons of, the post-Cold War values of markets and neoliberalism. And I think that one major lesson of that, which I was raised with, was that we made our mark on the world politically through what we bought and what we consumed. And I think we were sort of, people of my generation at least, were raised to almost discard the whole category of true political engagement and think of it as naive or overly earnest, and instead to think about defining ourselves through our consumer choices. And I think, especially on a challenge as big as climate, that's just the wrong path, and that we shouldn't burden ourselves with too much guilt about how we live as individuals if we're engaging politically to make change at the scale that's necessary. Because no matter what is done at the level of individuals, if we don't get large-scale policy change, we're not going to make any progress.
And I think it's... you go. So I think it's also extremely important to get away from this Eurocentric or, Western-centric narrative and actually look towards, obviously other, cosmologies, philosophies, but also solutions that are already being crafted in spaces that we're maybe not as familiar with in the global north. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Bangladesh and the Brahmaputra Valley, where people have historically been, they needed to build architectures that basically respond to flooding, simply because there's a wide river, it's 12 kilometers wide, and when it doesn't rain, India closes the dams, and when it rains, they open the dams. So basically the area is either very dry or extremely flooded. The architecture responds to that, and it's not built in any, super high-tech fancy way. So I think that, getting a bit away from our own obsession with our own selves and, whether we're able to consume or not consume, or I think we need to, go much deeper in our way of rethinking.
Yeah, and to David's point, it's interesting. I'm 82 as well, born in 82 when Krista was here. It's kind of funny. My mom's an artist, Mimi Ferré, abstract, wild, and she, my father was working on the surrounded islands here in 82. I was born in that summer, and he came on the boat to the hospital on Biscayne Bay. And that's part of my story, right? I knew that. My parents instilled in that. Christo's surrounded islands at the time, fabric that wrapped around barrier islands, talking about how people in Miami live between water and land, 3-year undertaking, massive. Now that might not be able to be done, right, with permitting, et cetera. Maybe they would use a material that was less impactful to, nature and the environment. But it did put Miami on the map in many regards. And those moments, hopefully, that we can inspire artists to think like that are important. And I do want to, give a shout out to local artists that are doing a lot. There's Javier Cortada, Oolite Art. They're all here during Art Basel and really bringing climate change, climate art related change here on the spotlight. There's coverage locally. They're trying to get to that coverage, for some of the bigger artists, but they do take advantage of this week. And so that is the beauty as 80,000 people come here, that we try and take the spotlight and also bring real world issues to light.
So I'm getting sense that we need to end. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for your questions and for being here.